All right, so today we're diving into a case that really flips the script on how we usually think about radicalization.
Yeah, this one's a real head scratcher.
It's a story where you've got privilege and education all mixed up with extremist ideology, and it makes you think.
It really does. It's like, how can someone with all the advantages in the world end up going down such a dark path?
And that's the question we're grappling with today with Umar Farouk Abdulmutallab.
The underwear bomber, right?
The one and only
Mm.
tried to blow up Northwest Airlines Flight 253 back in 2009.
A case that really makes you question everything you think you know about who becomes a terrorist.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
We've got a ton of material to sift through here. Excerpts from Abdulmutallab's own online posts, analyses of his radicalization accounts of the incident itself.
It's a lot to unpack.
So let's get right to it.
Yep.
We're trying to figure out, was Abdulmutallab a true believer driven by ideology?
Or was there something else going on? Was he a con artist, maybe manipulated by some shadowy figures?
Drifter or gifted? That's what we're here to figure out. And to understand any of this, we got to go back to the beginning. Who was Abdulmutallab before that fateful flight? And here's the thing, he wasn't some kid from the streets. This guy came from a wealthy, prominent family in Nigeria.
Oh, yeah. His father was a big-time banker. Umar had every advantage you could think of.
Elite boarding school in Togo, then University College London.
We're talking top-tier education, international travel.
A life most people would dream of.
Right. So we're not talking about someone who is driven to extremism because of poverty or lack of opportunity.
No, not at all. But here's where things get interesting. Running alongside this life of privilege was a deep, and I mean deep religious commitment.
And that's what's so striking, the contrast between his family's wealth and their relatively secular lifestyle and Umar's intense religiosity.
Even in his early online posts, you see it. He describes himself as ambitious and determined, especially in the deen.
The deen, meaning the religious way of life.
Exactly. He talked about striving to live by the Quran and Sunnah. So clearly religion was a huge part of his life from a young age.
Absolutely. But at the same time, he also talks about feeling lonely and isolated, especially during his time at boarding school.
Which is kind of surprising, right? You'd think you'd find a sense of community in that environment.
You would, but it seems like he felt like an outsider, even there.
And wouldn't you say that kind of isolation can make someone more susceptible to extremist ideologies?
Oh, absolutely. When you're feeling alienated and you're searching for a place to belong.
A group that offers that strong sense of community and purpose becomes really appealing.
They prey on that vulnerability.
And it seems like that's what happened with Abdulmutallab. He was super active in this online forum called Islam Forum, using the username Pharaoh1986.
And these forum posts are like a window into his mind.
You really get a sense of his thought process as he's wrestling with faith, identity, belonging.
And what's interesting is how he frames his struggles through the lens of Islamic concepts, particularly the idea of hijrah.
Hijra. Now, for those who aren't familiar, can you explain what that means in this context?
Sure, so hijrah literally means migration, but it's not always about physically moving to a different place.
Okay.
It can also be about a mental and social separation from non-believers. And you see this idea of withdrawing from the non-Muslim world pop up again and again in Abdulmutallab's posts.
So it's like he's creating his own mental hijra, withdrawing from the secular world that he sees as incompatible with his beliefs.
Exactly. And this just feeds into his feelings of isolation. He's not just physically isolated, he's actively choosing to isolate himself further by rejecting what he sees as the corrupting influences of the West.
And this is where that question of grifter or gifted really comes into play.
Right.
Is this genuine religious conviction driving his isolation? Or is it something else? Is he intentionally constructing this persona to fit in with a certain group online?
It's a tough question to answer, but one thing's for sure, his language starts to shift in a pretty disturbing direction. He starts expressing more and more resentment towards the West. Remember how you referred to the education system as kafir imposed?
Yeah, kafir being a derogatory term for non-believers.
Exactly. And that wasn't just a one-off comment. He repeatedly contrasts this kafir-imposed school system with his desire for a system based solely on the Quran and Sunnah.
Yeah, and you see this us versus them mentality become more and more pronounced in his posts. It's like he's viewing the world through this increasingly black and white lens.
No room for nuance or compromise.
Exactly. But here's the thing. Even as he's embracing this rigid worldview, there are moments where he seems genuinely torn.
Right.
Like he's aware of the darkness he's embracing, but can't quite pull back.
It's a fascinating contradiction. On one hand, he's drawn to this extremist ideology that offers a simple solution to a complex world. But on the other hand, you see these glimpses of a young man struggling with his own desires and temptations.
He talks about feeling lonely even when surrounded by people,
Right.
about his struggles with resisting temptation, particularly related to interactions with women. There's a vulnerability there that you can't ignore.
And that vulnerability is exactly what extremists exploit. They provide a sense of belonging, a sense of purpose, a simplistic worldview that divides the world into us and them.
So is this isolation and vulnerability driving him towards extremism? Or is he, like you said, constructing a persona to fit in and maybe even manipulate others? It's still so unclear.
Yeah. Let's dig a little deeper into his online activity and see if we can uncover some more clues. Because while the internet provided a breeding ground for his radicalization, it was likely his real-world interactions that solidified his path.
Let's do it. Okay, so we've got this young guy, right, feeling isolated, struggling to find his place in the world. He's deep in these online forums where some pretty extreme ideas are floating around.
Right, but it's important to remember the internet wasn't the only place where these ideas were taking hold.
Yeah, I mean, online spaces can create a sense of community, but it's often those real-world interactions.
Yet really solidify those extremist beliefs.
Push someone towards action.
Exactly. And in Abdulmutallab's case, there are a few figures who may have played a key role in his radicalization.
The sources point to a few names in particular. One that keeps coming up is Taimur al-Adli.
An Iraqi-born extremist who may have crossed paths with Abdulmutallab at University College London.
Right. It's not totally clear how close they were.
But it's certainly possible that al-Abdli exposed him to more radical ideas.
That kind of helped cement those anti-Western feelings.
Exactly.
And then there's Colin Green, a controversial Islamic preacher, known for his, pretty extreme views.
Definitely.
Abdulmutallab apparently attended some of his lectures.
Which probably didn't help.
I mean, Green was known for his fiery rhetoric,
Oh, yeah. He was a master at demonizing the West.
portraying Islam as under attack.
Really playing into that sense of victimhood that Abdulmutallab was already feeling.
So you've got these figures reinforcing the messages he's seeing online, pushing him further and further down this path of radicalization.
Right.
But there's one figure who stands out as potentially the most influential of all. Anwar al-Awlaki,
Al-Awlaki, the bin Laden of the internet.
notorious Al-Qaeda recruiter.
Incredibly effective at reaching young Muslims who are feeling alienated and disillusioned with the West.
And what's really chilling is that it seems like your contact may have gone beyond just online interactions.
Yeah. There's evidence that Abdulmutallab traveled to Yemen, where al-Awlaki was based.
And it's possible he received training from al-Awlaki himself.
If that's true, then al-Awlaki's influence on Abdulmutallab's actions is huge. I mean, he wasn't just preaching extremist ideology.
He was actively encouraging and directing acts of terrorism.
Exactly.
And that brings us to the attempted bombing itself. Christmas Day, 2009, Abdulmutallab boards Northwest Airlines Flight 253 in Amsterdam, headed for Detroit.
As the plane's approaching its destination, he tries to detonate explosives hidden in his underwear.
And it's only because the detonator malfunctioned,
That passengers and crew were able to stop him.
preventing what could have been a massive tragedy.
It's terrifying to think how close it came.
It really is. You can't even imagine the fear and chaos on that flight.
Right.
But then in the aftermath, you see this even more disturbing side of Abdulmutallab emerge.
What do you mean?
Well, in a video released after the attempted bombing,
Oh, yeah.
he appears alongside al-Awlaki, calmly and resolutely justifying his actions as a strike against the enemies of Islam.
It's a chilling video. It's hard to reconcile that image with the troubled young man we see in his forum posts. You know, the one wrestling with loneliness, temptation, that search for belonging.
It's like a complete transformation.
It really is.
And this is where that question of grifter or gifted becomes even more complicated.
How so?
Was his transformation genuine?
Yeah.
Was he really convinced that he was carrying out some righteous act?
Or was he just expertly manipulated by al-Awlaki, a master manipulator who preyed on his vulnerabilities and turned him into a weapon? I mean, if we have to remember, al-Awlaki was incredibly skilled at appealing to both the emotional and the ideological needs of his recruits.
He could make violence seem like a noble act of self-sacrifice.
Exactly.
So we've seen how Abdulmutallab's online activity reflects his growing radicalization, how real-world interactions with figures like al-Awlaki may have solidified his path, and how it all culminates in that horrifying act on Flight 253. But the question remains, was this driven by genuine conviction?
Or calculated manipulation.
To really grapple with that,
Mm-hmm.
I think we need to look at what happened after the attempted bombing, the consequences Abdulmutallab faced, and the global impact of his actions.
I think you're right. Let's do it.
So we've really gone deep on Abdulmutallab's journey, haven't we?
Yeah, from that privileged upbringing to his radicalization.
Exploring the influence of those key figures like al-Awlaki.
And reliving that terrifying moment on Flight 253.
It's been heavy stuff.
It has.
Yeah.
And I think as we dig into the aftermath, the weight of this whole story really hits you.
So what happened after the arrest?
Well, Abdulmutallab actually cooperated with authorities.
Really?
Yeah, he provided valuable intelligence about Al-Qaeda's operations and recruitment tactics.
See, that's what's so interesting. Even in his cooperation, that question of grifter or gifted still lingers.
Right. Was he truly remorseful, trying to make amends for what he did?
Or was it another manipulation? A way to game the system.
Well, we may never know for sure.
It's impossible to get inside his head.
But regardless of his motives, his cooperation led to increased security measures at airports all over the world.
Many of which we still see today.
Exactly.
Full-body scanners, enhanced pat-downs, the restrictions on liquids. It's crazy to think.
It all stems back to Abdulmutallab's attempt.
It's a stark reminder of the impact one person can have.
Right. The ripple effects that continue to shape how we travel to this day.
And it speaks to the power of fear, too, doesn't it?
Absolutely.
One individual driven by ideology can completely change how we live,
How we travel.
how we view the world.
It's a sobering thought. It reminds us that the threat of terrorism is real.
And it forces us to confront just how complex radicalization is.
And how difficult it is to combat.
We've seen how someone from a privileged background, with education, with opportunities, can still fall prey to these extremist ideologies.
And how the internet can connect those vulnerable individuals with charismatic figures like Al-Awlaki.
And throughout this whole deep dive we've wrestled with, I question, was Abdulmutallab a true believer?
A visionary warped by ideology.
Or was he a con artist expertly manipulated by those who wanted to create chaos and destruction?
It's the million-dollar question.
I honestly don't know if we can definitively answer that. Maybe it's not as simple either.
Right.
Maybe it's a bit of both.
It's certainly possible.
But what's clear is that his story is a cautionary tale. It shows us how blurry that line between conviction and manipulation can be.
And how devastating the consequences of extremism can be.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, I think the biggest takeaway for me is the importance of critical thinking.
Questioning narratives.
Seeking out different perspectives.
We need to be able to separate truth from lies.
Recognize the signs of manipulation.
And resist those tempting extremist ideologies.
Because ultimately, the ability to think critically, to really engage with information, that's our best defense.
Against the forces that want to divide and destroy us.
Couldn't have said it better myself.